I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think there may be a few others, and I understand from talking to Richard that there's a possibility that there may be a plan B for next week or something like that. And we're talking then about maybe picking this, maybe even take another week off at the end of it on Holy Week, and then picking up the last one after that or something like that, because they want me to do the whole thing, but because I said, well, that would mess up the whole flow of the class. And Richard said, well, we can maybe pick it up later. So anyway, tonight we are going to be talking about Jonathan Edwards, and I've got some books as always to show, but I forgot to show you this last week about John Owen. Peter Toon's probably got the best biography, God's Statesman, The Life and Work of John Owen. So if you're into Peter Toon, this is not new, it's about 30 years old or so, but it's still a good book. And I should also mention that if any of you are my Facebook friends, you probably noticed the cup that I posted today. It was a quote from John Owen: either kill sin or it will kill you. You can get those cups, with the meat with the sayings on it, and I thought that was, guys, I put it, I said, for all my old dead guys class friends, you got either kill sin or it will kill you. Okay, tonight we are talking about Jonathan Edwards, and he is a very fascinating and important American thinker. We've now, for the first time, come to an American thinker. We are now in the 18th century. There's a picture of him, and you can actually see some of his handwritten notes. I have a good friend who we went to graduate school here at Iowa together. He is one of the leading experts on Jonathan Edwards. Jerry McDermott, I'll mention a couple of his books later. He's on the board of the Jonathan Edwards Society. He and Michael McClyman have written the definitive book on the theology of Jonathan Edwards, and about 8 other books that he's written on the theology of Jonathan Edwards. He gets invited to every one of the big conferences, and he can read that. He showed me that years ago, and he said, this is what I go to Beinecke Library at Yale University on my trips to read, because they have all these manuscripts. There are over 1,000 sermon manuscripts and 1,200 pages of sermons and 1,000 pages of notes that Edwards did. And they all look like that. And Jerry, it's like learning a new language, but he learned to read it. It's English, but that's the way he wrote them. Okay, as far as some materials for those who are interested in learning about Jonathan Edwards, the definitive set of works of Jonathan Edwards is done by Yale University Press. Big fat volumes, most of them about that thick. 26 have appeared in print, but they're stopping putting them in print. The total number is 79. The others are all available online. And most of those are his sermons. Sermons from various times that he put online. So, if you want to read Jonathan Edwards, you can actually go online and read. Now, the older editions, this is this volume one. I didn't bring both. There's a 2-volume set like this that has most of his major works and some samples of his sermons. This is a 19th century edition. If you look at it, you can see it's very tiny print. And this is in print. You can get new copies for about $60. Used copies. There have been 2 editions of this. 2 publishers have done it. Banner of Truth is the most common one. They now have brown covers. They switched from blue desk jackets to brown, a little duller looking. But anyway, plus there are dozens and dozens of other versions of Edwards, like this little Jonathan Edwards Basic Works. When I bought this years ago and used it for a class, it was 95 cents. And it probably cost you about $3.95 now, but still, you can get really cheap. And we're going to talk about his work on religious affections. $10. You can buy a paperback copy of it. He has been anthologized in all sorts of versions. His works are as accessible as you can get. And by the way, unlike John Owen, as I mentioned last week, who's hard to read, Edwards is actually, if you can read his manuscript, it's actually relatively easy to read, comparatively speaking. He's not that difficult to read. He just writes, when he writes in a tiny little cramped style. Now, as far as books about Jonathan Edwards, I don't have a copy of it with me, but the definitive biography is in a long and a short version by George Marsden, who taught at various places, Calvin College, Duke, and then and then Notre Dame in his last years. Wonderful man, a Bible-believing Christian. His father was a minister in my denomination. He was raised in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and he's a Christian believer. And he is a gracious man because he came as a visiting professor when I was in seminary, and we took a seminar on American religious history with him. And every one of our papers got footnoted in the book on fundamentals of American culture with great, I'm indebted to this, and my name is in there, and so were about all my friends from the class. Well, most professors with big reputations don't footnote their students' names in there. And George is a very gracious man. The university has had him come speak here, and he's written the definitive. He's got the short version and the big 600-page version. So if you like the 200-page version or the 600-page, George Marsden is the man to go to. Now, as far as other studies of the theology of Jonathan Edwards, my friend Gerald McDermott has written 2 short versions, and Michael McClyman has written this one called Encounters with God as well. And then McClyman, who's also an evangelical Christian, and Jerry, who's an evangelical Anglican, Jerry is the one who was a friend of mine in Iowa, did a big 600-page theology. They collaborated and did a 600-page theology of Jonathan Edwards. Plus, you get, for example, Mark Noll, one of the other great American religious historians who succeeded George at Notre Dame in that endowed chair there. America's God, byline from Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln. And you get lots of talk about Jonathan Edwards in a major book on American religious thinking. You also have dozens, I'm not kidding, of books such as these. Edwards in Our Time, these are just a couple I have. The New England Theology, from Jonathan Edwards to Edwards Amazing Park. They have conferences all over the place. I happen to be at myself, and I'll talk more about it later, the first major Jonathan Edwards conference in 1984 was held at Wheaton College, and I was there. And that kicked off what's about every 2 or 3 years, a Jonathan Edwards conference. And this summer, the Jonathan Edwards Institute in Europe, which is centered in Brussels, Belgium, at the Evangelical Theological Faculty, they're hosting one, unless the coronavirus makes it stop. But there's going to be a major conference on Jonathan Edwards in Europe. There's Australian conferences. There are conferences, so it's not just Americans who like Jonathan Edwards. He's everywhere. And there's, for example, fascinating little book here by A Reader's Guide to the Major Writings of Jonathan Edwards, where leading scholars will summarize his major writings. My friend Jerry summarized one of the key things we're going to look at today, his book on religious affections. And if you like a quirky book, this is a few years old, but I haven't quite read this. I haven't read this. A friend, an elderly woman gave this to me, but I know it's a good book. Elizabeth Dodd's Marriage to a Difficult Man. The Uncommon Union of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards. So if you want to read something quirky, you can read about his wife who found him somewhat of a difficult man. Not because he was a nasty guy, because he had odd habits. And so you can learn about Jonathan Edwards from a variety of ways. And Jonathan Edwards, as I mentioned here, is a theologian who often brings sharp responses. Get our notes up here. Especially when he's only known for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which I suspect most of you read at one time or another. Oftentimes it seems to be in junior year English books. I do some sub-teaching, and I was out at West Branch a few years ago, and lo and behold, I was doing junior English. Guess what we were talking about? I don't think they expected to get someone who knew something about Jonathan Edwards subbing for them that day, but they read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It's authentic Jonathan Edwards, but it is about as unrepresentative of his sermons as any sermon you'll ever find. So people who think they know Jonathan Edwards from that sermon, they don't have really a clue what Jonathan Edwards' sermonizing in theology was like. He believed in hell. Remember, that's the one where he has to pick the holding you over hell with the thin spider, and all God has to do is just cut the string and you fall into hell, which is, it's grotesque if you will, imagery, but it's got biblical reality behind it. We are just that close if God would decide to do that. It's not untrue. But a lot of people don't like it. They think he must be some crazy hellfire and brimstone sermonizer. He's not. We'll learn more about that. As I said, he's overwhelmingly considered the greatest theologian ever to live in America. Many said he's also one of America's greatest philosophers. And he also wrote one of the greatest works of religious psychology. hard to be a guy who is the greatest in 3 fields, but he really is. He's clearly one of America's greatest intellectuals. My friend Jerry gave me this particular number D, this particular quote here. The Encyclopedia of American Religious Experience has more references to him than any other single individual. So he's a biggie, shall we say. He has been extremely influential to many modern evangelical thinkers. If you're a John Piper fan, John Piper has stressed that the greatest single influence upon him was Jonathan Edwards. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the famous English preacher of a past generation, said he stumbled, by the way, into an old edition of this set, and he devoured it, and he said it revolutionized his ministry. And he asked somebody, who should I read? He said, get Edwards. And when I get done with him, what should I do? Get more Edwards. When I'm done with him, what should I do? Get more Edwards. He supposedly told a young minister something. So he was a fan. He was a fan of Jonathan Edwards. R.C. Sproul, through his mentor, John Gerstner, also a professor of mine, is also an Edwards fan. So if you look at modern evangelicalism and the people who've influenced it, Edwards is there. Now, having said that, there are several sides to Edwards. And I am not nearly as big an Edwards fan, frankly, as some, and you'll maybe see why. Because some of the sides to Edwards I really like. A couple of the other sides I'm not quite as much a fan of. But as we go through this, we'll understand that. He was a great thinker, but he was also a pastor for 30 years and a great defender of the revival known as the First Great Awakening. Oftentimes, he's simply referred to as a Calvinist theologian, and he would have upheld all the basic doctrines that Calvin and Owen and Luther, all of those, the Reformation theologians, upheld. However, he was a very distinct type of Calvinist theologian, one who emphasized conversion. And the way he emphasized conversion will have a very distinct flavor in his theology. We'll unpack that when we get to the actual theology. And discerning what is genuine spirituality. Roger Olson, who's actually the Armenian Baptist theologian, says he is a distinctly American version of Reformed theology. He also had a speculative side. Now, this is one of my favorite things about Edwards. He would go for long walks on horseback or walks in the woods, and he would carry little pieces of paper and a little stubby pencil, and he would have all these glorious thoughts, and he would write them down, and his wife said he came back, his coat would be covered with little pieces of paper, because he had pins, and he had pinned the little pieces of paper to his coat. The whole front of his coat would be covered, and what she would ask I had this glorious thought when I was out walking or riding my horseback ride. And he would go in his study, and he would write a little short thing in his notebook. We have page and page after page of his notebooks, which is why he's an interesting guy, in which he would write down these speculative thoughts. And they're called his miscellanies, by the way, and several volumes of them have been published. And many of them were highly speculative. And he would often attempt to explain some aspect of traditional Reformed theology in a new and very unusual way. He rarely published these, but they show a fertile mind, and he did write a number of major theological treatises that broke ground. Now here, when you think about Edwards with the fertile mind, the speculative mind, most Orthodox Reformed theologians, when they read Edwards, sometimes they kind of put up with that, and they're not real wild about some of the speculations. The people who are interested in philosophy and intellectual history love that side of Edwards, because that's the side of Edwards, and one of them supposedly said this: I don't know what he wasted his time being a preacher for. The guy with a mind like that, he said he should have been in an academic position and could have written on all this stuff, but he wasted his time for 30 years as a parish pastor. In other words, they can't figure out why Edwards spent all his time, if as a nursemaid, if you will, as you'll see, very cranky parishioners who didn't really like him all that much. And, and instead he could have been writing these glorious treatises flowing out of this fertile mind of his. And this is what's particularly an interesting thing. Some of it, of the new ground, has been highly contested by a number of Orthodox Reformed theologians. Now, The late John Gerstner, who I've studied with, and he was R.C. Sproul's mentor. Some of you listened to Gerstner and know John Gerstner. Tended to read Edwards through the lens of Reformed Orthodoxy. Gerstner was a fan of 17th century Swiss theologian Francis Turretin, or Tarretin, as he tended to call it. He had an interesting gravelly voice, and he would say Tarretin. And he loved to mention that Edwards called him the Great Tarretin. I took a class on Tarretin with Edwards, and I mean with Gerstner. He probably said that 15 or 20 times throughout the class. Edwards called him the Great Tarretin. But he would read Edwards through Reformed Orthodoxy. And he wrote and Gerstner wrote a 3-volume, The Rational Biblical Theology of Jonathon Edwards. But it's seen through the lens of Reformed Orthodoxy. And a lot of times, Gerstner just sort of downplayed that speculative side of Edwards. And really, it seems to me, almost ignored that it was there. Not ignored it completely. He did like his work on the freedom of the will. But sometimes these directions would take Edwards really quite far afield in some areas from classic Reform, Turretin and other classic Reformed theologians. And so he left behind this mixed legacy for his direct followers. And the followers that he had were oftentimes called the New Divinity. Why? Because they weren't the garden variety classic Reformed theology. And the other Reformed theologians recognized it, and they didn't like it. The people at Princeton, for example, did not like the direction that the New Divinity, and they wrote critical treatises of them. Some of them took that speculative bent and went into some really unusual directions. Now, among modern followers, it's generally the evangelical Reformed side of Edwards that the evangelical people, your John Pipers and your Martin Lloyd-Jones like. And they like his defense of an evangelical pro-revival theology and spirituality. As I said, modern university scholars love the speculative side of Edwards. The first really modern biographer was Perry Miller, an atheist professor at Harvard, who loved Edwards for his intellectual genius. And he said he was the most brilliant man he had ever worked with. Now, coming from an atheist Harvard professor to say Edwards was the most brilliant man he'd ever worked with is saying a lot. There have been, as I said, conferences galore. I happen to have been at the first major one in 1984 at Wheaton College. And among the keynote addresses was an atheist intellectual historian, Bruce Kuklick of the University of Pennsylvania, who said Edwards was the founder of the longest-running philosophical school in America. And he later expanded that paper into a major book called Churchmen and Philosophers. But Bruce Kuklick, again, was an atheist, and he liked that speculative side of Edwards. As I said, there have been scores of conferences and dozens of books of essays about him. Each decade, the number of doctoral theses on Edwards in a wide variety of fields, I'll give you some of them there, theology, history, English, psychology, communications, and philosophy, has doubled every decade. I wrote a paper on Edwards for one of my graduate seminars, and the professor here was a very liberal, he identified with the Christian tradition, Dr. Schweiger did, but he would be very liberal. He would not have been orthodox in the slightest. But he was a Jonathan Edwards fan, and he tried to convince me to write a thesis on Jonathan Edwards, because he said, that's where the action is. I decided not to. My friend Jerry did, and his thesis got the Spriestersbach Award for the best thesis at the University of Iowa that year. And that's why he gets invited to all the big name conferences and is a leading Jonathan Edwards scholar. But it's clearly there wasn't a prejudice against evangelicals working in the field, because evangelicals actually are the leaders in Jonathan Edwards studies. The Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale University houses his manuscripts, all those funny little manuscripts that we showed. And Yale University Press has published the 26 thick volumes, the hard copy, and the 79 when the online ones. And the key staff there at the Jonathan Edwards Center is mostly evangelicals. The key editor is Harry Stout, an evangelical. He's a Reformed persuasion, teaches at Yale. The Ken Minkema is the executive director of that. And as I said, we have 1,200 of his sermons and thousands of pages of his philosophical and theological notes and handwritten notes on virtually every passage of the Bible. He had several Bibles that had the text on one side and blank page on the other. He would write in that little cramped style all his notes on the biblical texts. As I said, there are several Jonathan Edwards centers around the globe, including Australia, and one in Brussels, Belgium, that is holding a conference in July this year. Now, it's interesting what noted American Lutheran theologian Robert Jensen said about Jonathan Edwards. He wrote a book about Edwards calling him America's theologian. So, having said all that, you say, okay, obviously you convinced me, hopefully, that this is an important guy to talk about. Let's talk about his life then. He was born in East Windsor, Connecticut, the son of a Puritan minister, and he had 10 sisters, each of whom was 6 feet tall. 10 6-feet-tall sisters. He used to joke that his father, Timothy Edwards, had a double basketball team. Because if you can imagine, there aren't that many 6-foot-tall women today. Chris has a couple of daughters who I think are about that tall, but there aren't that many of them. But he had 10 sisters, all who were 6 feet tall. He was about 6'3" or something like that himself. So he was, comparatively speaking, he was not the tallest in family because, there's always a difference between the men and the women. Now, I find this interesting. While most of his heritage on both sides was godly, both ancestors and descendants, he got a father and a grandfather who were ministers, and one of his sons and grandsons were in addition to a number of his other descendants. Somebody traced his descendants, and it's a glowing kind of a picture because he had a bunch of sons of his descendants. But he was also the grandfather of Aaron Burr, the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton in the duel and was trying to set up a counterfeit government in the United States. If you know Aaron Burr, he was a scoundrel. So that was a grandson of Jonathan Edwards. And he had a great aunt who was convicted of infanticide and an great uncle who was an axe murderer. That's no joke. So you can realize that you can have a godly heritage in many ways, but there can always be black sheep in the family, and his black sheep were real black sheep. Really, that's the only way you could say about it, on both going both directions. Now, the Puritan tradition is crucial to Jonathan Edwards. We talked about the Puritan tradition with Owen last week, and we didn't highlight this too much, but here's where we need to highlight it. The Puritan tradition, remember, he said, was a branch of the Reformed tradition that emphasized practical godliness. And we said last week that Owen was both a Puritan and a high Orthodox. He emphasized the precision in theology and the practical godliness. The particular subdivision of Puritanism that Edwards was born into also tended to emphasize the experience of conversion as a living reality. In other words, when you were converted, it wasn't just like a simple little prayer or transaction with God, if you will, like modern evangelicals oftentimes had. Well, I was at a revival meeting and I knew I was a sinner and I walked forward and I prayed a little prayer and now I'm converted. For Edwards and the Puritan tradition that he came from, that wasn't cut it at all. It was a real life-changing experience that you could sense had happened. And it's interesting that this will play into the particular type of Puritan Calvinist theology that he would defend. Now, he was a precocious, somewhat introverted child, and we know that he wrote a detailed study of spiders. Every little biographical sketch will tell you about his famous, he was a kid, and he studied spiders, and it's quite detailed, and quite anatomically very detailed about spiders. He also wrote a treatise on the colors of the rainbow, and scholars who read it said he showed awareness of Isaac Newton's optics, which was brand new, cutting-edge physics at the time. How could a 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid have read Isaac Newton's optics? Jonathan Edwards had. He was this precocious child, kind of a studious, brainy, precocious child. Now, sometime about the time he entered college, we're not quite sure when, he experienced his own conversion. As I said, conversion would be crucial. And this is what's interesting about his conversion was by meditating on 1 Timothy 1:17. What's that text? I'll give you the start of it here. Now unto the King, eternal, immortal, God only wise, which is a statement about the being of God. Edwards was not converted in reading an exposition of the gospel. He was converted by reading a biblical statement about attributes of God. And he says, that's when I was converted. He says, and he will later use this phrase, a new sense, a new taste of the beauty and glory of God. So his notion of conversion, again, is somewhat different than what modern evangelicals sometimes think. his mother's side of the family is going to be important in his story as well, because his mother was the daughter of Solomon Stoddard, minister in Northampton in western Massachusetts. Now, Jonathan Edwards is in eastern Connecticut, not far from New Haven on the coast. Out in western Massachusetts is Northampton, all the way across the part of Massachusetts. And his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, had been the minister in this church in Northampton, a large church. It had 1,300 members for over 60 years and was one of the most prominent ministers in colonial New England. He was so dominant that he was frequently jokingly referred to as the Pope of the Connecticut Valley, because they said if Pastor Stoddard spoke, people listened. That's how influential he was. Edwards received a good classical education as a boy, and like many of these other precocious, brilliant theologians, he's entered university young at age 12. He entered what is called Yale University. It was called Yale College then. And he graduated a few years with his BA and his MA. During his time at Yale, he studied intently the new intellectual movement coming out of the European Enlightenment. We will spend more time the next time we meet, whether it's next week or the following week, talking about the Enlightenment. But it was a major new intellectual movement which was challenging traditional authorities and traditional theology all over the place. And he devoured the works of John Locke, for example, at one point. He said that he devoured Locke like a miser does discovering a stash of gold. That was his actual phrase. Like a miser discovering a stash of gold, so I devoured John Locke. And he would use some of this new intellectual thinking and sort of turn it back on itself to defend Calvinistic Orthodox Reformed theology. And defending classic Reformed theology in reference to Enlightenment thought would be a lifelong goal, and many have claimed that he did it better than any other thinker in doing that. He served a brief stint as a supply preacher in a Presbyterian church in New York City, and then in a congregational church in Connecticut, not far from his home. He served as a tutor at Yale for a few years. They said as a young man he kind of actually liked that because he was not a people person. We'll learn more about that. And then he was called to be an assistant pastor to his aging grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. So he moved across the state of Massachusetts to western Massachusetts, in Northampton, and he would succeed his grandfather when his grandfather died. At the age of 24, he married Sarah Pierpont, and they had the one who wrote about the book Marriage to a Difficult Man is written. And they had 11 children together, 8 sons and 3 daughters. All but one reached adulthood. So unlike John Owen, who lost all of his children in childhood, almost all of Edwards' 100 years later lived to adulthood. I don't think it was because they had that much greater medicine when we learn about Edwards' own death ourselves, but his children survived. But he lived under the shadow of his grandfather, and his relationship with his parishioners was often very rocky. And interestingly enough, he was not a natural orator, and in his early ministry, he mostly read his sermons without much eye contact. Some have claimed that there are accounts, and these have been disputed a little bit, but many have claimed that in the early days, he would either look at his manuscript or look at the bell rope in the back, and then look back at his manuscript and look at the bell rope in the back, and look at his manuscript and look at the bell rope in the back, never having any eye contact. Now, when the Great Awakening broke out and great extemporaneous preachers like Whitefield came around, he realized he needed to try to change. It's been said that he really adored Whitefield, was impressed with him and tried to imitate him, and he did eventually learn to preach more extemporaneously. But he never was very good at extemporaneous preaching. And they said that toward the end he would take and make little palm-sized notes, and that's why he learned to write so tiny, because he would write his whole outlines, and then he would preach holding this up like this. A little palm, and he would preach and then look at his notes, his outline, that he would have in the palm of his hand. But Whitefield said one time that he would, I didn't put this in here, but that if he could have the eloquence with words that Edwards had, he would gladly trade his oratorical eloquence, which Whitefield had, any day for the eloquence of words, because Edwards was a wordsmith. He had an ability with words that very few have matched. Now, he finally did, by the way, come to realize he was a different personality than Whitefield. Now, in the church, shortly after he took over, just a few years after he took over from his grandfather, a revival broke out. And a large number professed conversion. But the revival cooled rather quickly after that, and its reputation got tarnished some because one of Edwards' uncles, you remember his grandfather had been the pastor there, so he had relatives, uncles, and the Williams family in particular. They were sometimes the worst people for him, were these relatives of his. Because after all, he was probably young Johnny to them. You know, he didn't quite have the reputation because it was family. But one of his uncles committed suicide, and another man committed suicide, and several others said they had suicidal thoughts, voices, hearing them, telling them to commit suicide. So within a year or two after a great revival, you have all of a sudden this rash of suicides or would-be suicides, which led a lot of people to say, well, this is bad then, this revival of interest in what seemed like too excitable type of religion. Other problems. The balcony of the church collapsed during the service, literally. And several people were killed. And after that, tension broke out on how to rebuild the church, because Edwards wanted it's seating according to age, because this is before amplification. He wanted to be able, the old people could sit up near the front. Why? Because as I'm gradually learning, I don't hear so well, Jenny, and I sometimes in the house will say, across the house, what did you say? I didn't hear you. You know, I find myself doing that. You know, I mean, I don't have as acute a hearing. But many of the wealthy businessmen in town didn't like that. They wanted to be able to sit because they had assigned pews that you got. They wanted to sit up near the front because they could march in and everyone would see, oh, there's Mr. So-and-so, the owner of the milling business in town, and there was a great tension. He also urged them in signing the church covenant that they had to use more equitable business practices, because some of these businessmen were noted whenever there was a scarcity, they jacked the prices way up. And he didn't like that. So he butted heads with them over business practices. Another revival breaks out in 1739 and 1740, again with large-scale professions of faith, and a visit by the noted evangelist George Whitefield, but that cooled down after a few years. It was during that second revival that he preached the famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, not in his own church, but he was asked to visit another church in Enfield, Connecticut, which was just down the river, the Connecticut River, and he preached that there. And supposedly people said that he couldn't finish the sermon, because in spite of that rather unimpressive style, people cried out and shrieked with conviction as a result of that sermon. So he was, as you know, a wordsmith. If you've read that, you know that he could paint word pictures as well as anyone. But he was not a people person. Now this is interesting. If you're a pastor and you try to put yourself in this shoe, he told his congregation when he took the call, I don't do visits very well, so I'm not going to do them. I'm going to spend my whole time in the study. I won't visit people. If you really ask me, I think I can probably come. In other words, if you're on death's door, but I don't visit. I don't do that, so I won't. I'm going to just spend my time in the study. Now, you can imagine if good news, if Pastor Chris simply announced to the elders one day, I don't do anything else but spend my time in the study. You might say, well, wait a minute, I think we hired you for more than that. But Edwards told them that. I don't do that. Some maids don't do windows. He didn't do anything but study. That's all he did. And he botched certain things. For example, the bad book controversy. This is, we think we've had, we sometimes think that modern struggles are with certain types of things people haven't seen yet. But well, they have the bad book controversy. What was it? Well, one of the ladies in the town was a midwife, and she had a book of anatomy and with explicit pictures so you could learn to be a midwife. Well, some teenage boys got a hold of it somehow and were passing it around each other, and it was sort of like 17th century pornography, 18th century pornography. Explicit pictures of women's bodies. And, teenage boys were passing it around. Well, Edwards didn't handle it well because he got up from the pulpit and named all the names of all of the boys who he thought knew about it, including some boys who had not seen it at all, but simply knew of its existence and had not actually, which is a really impolitic, shall we say, way of handling it's called the bad book controversy. he got himself even in further trouble over trying to reverse his grandfather's practice on communion. Now this is, to get to know all the details of this, we'd have to go into a much longer explanation of the communion practices of the churches of Massachusetts and Connecticut. But in a nutshell, it's this. His grandfather had adopted a very wide open practice of communion, not only for any professing Christian, but anybody who wanted it because he believed in taking the Lord's Supper. It was a converting ordinance that you would likely to be converted in the practice of taking the Lord's Supper. Edwards, on the other hand, had come to the conclusion of a very restricted view of communion. And it was only for those who can profess conversion. And when we look at Edwards' theology, you'll understand that for conversion for him was not simply a profession of faith. It was something very deep and earth-shattering. And he was going to be the one who would judge the conversions to be genuine, legitimate. So you couldn't take communion unless he met with you and told you you were genuinely converted and could take communion. It's a total flip-flop from his grandfather's practice. And it irritated especially his relatives to no end, because they said, you totally have turned Pastor Stoddard's position on its head. Why this newfangled approach? Pastor Stoddard had this for 60 years here. Wide open communion. The most wide open communion practice you could ever have, all of a sudden has gone to one of the most restrictive. He also protested the shabby treatment of Native Americans, which rankled some. Now, interestingly enough, Edwards, we know he owned at least one slave, and he did defend slavery at one point. But interestingly enough, he also clearly argued that all people, including Native Americans and African Americans, were to be treated as those made in the image of God, and he said so. And then there were Native Americans not that far away from them in western Massachusetts at that time, and that also rankled some of them. I'm not sure they're quite like some of the Scots-Irish who said the only good Indian was a dead Indian, which some of them on the Pennsylvania frontier did. But some of them were not too keen on Native Americans, especially because Native Americans in western Massachusetts had a reputation of coming down and doing a lot of looting and scalping and other things. But he called for fair treatment. All of this meant that eventually he was dismissed by an overwhelming majority vote. So one biographer has called it a landslide. He was voted out by a landslide, but they couldn't find another minister, and listen to this, he stayed on for a year as pulpit supply after they had voted him out for a landslide. I've never heard of a pastor who gets voted out by a landslide, stays on for a year because they can't find another pastor. But he did. And by the way, it also gave him a very bad taste for congregational church government. He said they can boot you out on your ear anytime they want to. He didn't like it. And he expressed a desire to become a Presbyterian. He says, because they can't boot you out on an ear. They have to call a Presbyterian meeting, and you have other people who will make a decision whether they can get rid of you, not just a local congregation. And he was going to transfer to the Presbyterian Church when he took the position at Princeton College as president. It's down the page just a little bit. But where did he go from there? He didn't go directly to Princeton. He went for 7 years as the pastor of a small congregation that was made up of Mohican Indians and some more crotchety English settlers who didn't particularly seem to like him. The Mohican settlers didn't speak English and he didn't speak Mohican, so he preached to them through a translator. He tried to teach them English, but they didn't catch on too quickly, at least not enough to understand his sermons, which were always intense doctrinal sermons. And it did, though, provide him a time to write most of his major theological and philosophical works. He had extra time on his hands. It was a small congregation, unlike 1,300 people, and he had time to write these things. He then took a call to be president of the College of New Jersey, which later was renamed as Princeton University. He arrived in 1757. He's still only in his 50s. A smallpox epidemic was going around, so he decided to be vaccinated for smallpox as to set a good example. And the vaccination went bad. And within a few months, he died. And they said he was in great pain. He couldn't speak, he couldn't swallow, he couldn't eat. The smallpox will cut your throat off. And it was a painful death for a man who had spent his life as a preacher. So that, in a nutshell, is the life of Jonathan Edwards. And some of his treatises will also, you'll see how what he's probably, or his finest work of theology, is interconnected with his life, as is often the case of some of the people we study. Well, let's talk about some of the basics of his theology. Interestingly enough, first point I'm going to make here is, more than any other theologian, he put beauty at the center of his theology. And you say, beauty? Yes. Beauty and the beauty of holiness were at the center of his theology. He talked about beauty. Hopefully you'll understand a little bit better as we go on. He had very high views of the sovereignty and majesty of God, and extolling the glory of God was extremely important, but he loved to speak of the beauty of holiness. Again, Roger Olson, who's not a Reformed theologian at all, claims that no theologian in the history of the church had a higher view of God's majesty, God's glory, and God's power than Jonathan Edwards. He wrote in a number of areas, including defending the doctrine of original sin against someone who was denying it, an English theologian named Chubb, who was denying original sin. He put his own unique spin on the doctrine, and he wrote a classic work on the freedom of the will. I'll talk a little bit more about his particular spin on that. And because a particularly rationalistic form of Arminianism was creeping into New England at that time, and it greatly disturbed him. And he wrote against it in several places. And he utilized some of the new philosophy of John Locke in his defense of traditional Reformed theology, traditional Calvinism. Now, in the freedom of the will, which most people think is probably his, among the philosophers, they kind of like it as his greatest work, but most theologians will argue that his religious affections is his greatest work. And that's why we're going to talk more in detail about his religious affections. But in the freedom of the will, he argued against both classical Arminianism and the new deism of the Enlightenment, both of which were emphasizing libertarian ideas of free will. Now here's where you got to follow Edwards very carefully, because he's going to give a very distinct definition here. He argued that both were wrong because there is no faculty of will. He said that's an invention. Instead, the will is simply the person choosing. In other words, people will say, God gave me a free will. He said, well, God can't give you a free will because there's no faculty of will. You simply are the person choosing. That's what will is. There's no faculty called will. Like God doesn't say, let me pop a will into you. No, you make choices. And he said this way, he argued for both a type of, quote, free will and yet a kind of determinism as well. The human always chooses according to the strongest motives, and the motives drive the will. Let me give you an example. He would say, some people will choose vanilla ice cream, some people will choose chocolate ice cream. He says, it's not that somehow that he said, quote, a will without a motive, it can't ever choose. It's just flip-flopping around. A will always chooses according to the motive. In other words, if you choose either vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream because you like vanilla or you like chocolate. And willing is simply the act of acting on the desire, the impulse that you have to either pick chocolate or pick vanilla. You can also get it into moral things. He would argue that nobody could actually do anything, quote, against your will. Because he said, for example, man comes in, Dr. Gerstner used to love this example. He was an Edwardsian on this. He said, someone holds a gun to you and says, give me your wallet or I'll blow you to pieces. And you could say, he forced me against my will. Dr. Gerstner said Edwards would say, no, he didn't. You willingly gave him your wallet rather than having him blow you to pieces. You could have willingly, just as willingly, if the motive to not to hold onto your wallet and let him shoot you was stronger, but the motive to hand him your wallet and not have him blow you to pieces was stronger. You were acting according to the strongest motive, whatever the motive was at the time. So that's the choice that you're making. Now, the thing where it gets speculative about his formulation is he didn't allow for any secondary causation in his development of this. Classic Reformed theology had argued for a kind of compatibilism where there were secondary causes, and yes, in salvation the will was in bondage to sin and depravity, and Edwards would have agreed with that. But Edwards' formulation of this was such that God was the primary mover behind all the motives. And that's where people have said it's both a kind of, he's arguing for free will and determinism at the same time. Because God is the one behind the motives. That was different than classic Reformed theology in many ways. And some have even said that if you read Edwards in many of his passages, and I've seen a few of those, I'm not an expert on this particular doctrine of his, that he talks about God continuously creating us at every moment. And some have said that makes it hard for him to get out from the doctrine of God being the author of sin and the cause of evil. Even John Gerstner admitted that although Edwards tried, Dr. Gerstner wasn't totally satisfied with Edwards' answer here. So this is where the speculative side of Edwards, sometimes in trying to answer the deist and very rationalistic Arminian theologians that he was arguing with, got himself speculative and set up a new type of doctrine of the bondage of the will, different than Luther and Calvin's doctrine of the bondage of the will, which was primarily focused on two things. Luther and Calvin would have said we are in bondage to our sin, and God's grace has to break that bondage so we can believe. And God is sovereign over all, but God is using secondary causation in this world. Edwards had almost no discussion of secondary causation. It was like God was the sole cause behind all things. And that is what made him different. Now also, he preached, interestingly enough, a long series of sermons on justification by faith. And that had actually sparked his first revival. But his own doctrine of justification is problematic. I actually wrote a paper on Edwards' doctrine of justification, and I wasn't the first one to notice this. My friend Jerry McDermott has written pretty widely. I've actually heard him speak at a conference on this topic, that Edwards differs from Luther and Calvin on justification. Not on the idea of imputed righteousness, but on what faith is. The sticky point is Edwards tends to equate faith and love. Faith and love are virtually identical for Edwards. And as Jerry McDermott, one of the leading Edwards scholars, says that Edwards really believes in justification by a godly grace-induced disposition, which is the root of both faith and love, which is why he can almost interchange faith and love. He does this especially in his sermons on 1 Corinthians 13, charity and its fruits. Dr. McDermott, Jerry says that he's closer in some ways to Aquinas on that, because Aquinas said that the faith that was formed by love is what justifies. Now, there have been a lot who've noticed this before, and there have been a couple of recent attempts to try to salvage Edwards. One of them, Josh Moody, pastor at Wheaton College Church, and also a admitted PhD in Edwards studies, has written a book on Edwards on justification. He argues if you read Edwards, what we would call appreciatively, and give Edwards the benefit of the doubt, you can make him fit well with classic Reformed theology. But he admits it's tricky. Now, a new man, not the Michael McClendon dude I was talking about, a Michael McClendahan, who is just finished a PhD from Cambridge on Edwards, has written a new book on Edwards and justification. I read a blurb about it. He claims that he disagrees with this mainstream interpretation. And he says if you look at Edwards in the context of the people he was arguing with, he's an Orthodox Reformation guy. But my read of this, and this is something I have a lot of firsthand experience with, is it's tricky. Because he does tend to blur faith and love. Why is, you might say, what's the problem with this? Well, love is the summary of the law. And it's easy then if you start talking about we're justified by making love and faith the same, where it becomes something internally in you then that is the grounds of justification. And Edwards he's really slippery on that. Another interesting few things before we start to look at his most important theological contribution is he wrote a lot of prophetic speculation of a postmillennial type. He never hardly ever preached on this stuff, but his notebooks are full of it. You might say, what's postmillennialism? The polar opposite of the popular dispensational premillennialist that the Schofield Bible, Hal Lindsey, and all the prophetic guys with all the charts do. Edwards would have looked at that, by the way, and thought it was nuts. He would not have understood it. The dispensational premillennialism wasn't invented till 1840. And nobody in Edwards' day would have understood. If you would have been talking about the rapture and a future tribulation and the Jews and an Antichrist, they would have scratched their head and said, what are you talking about? Would not have a clue what you're talking about. That wasn't invented until 1840, that particular interpretation. But Edwards was a post-millennialist. He believed that through revivals, the world was going to become mostly Christian. And he believed that the revivals that were going on during his time were the first stages of that. He even at one point speculated the millennial kingdom was going to start here in the New World, he said, due to the revivals that were happening. And he speculated on this. He was also would link them to contemporary events. Again, if you link to contemporary events in the pulpit, he always used them as signs of judgment. There's been an earthquake, you should repent. He did that fairly often. But he would have taken the coronavirus today and he would have preached a sermon, we all need to repent because we all might die because of the coronavirus. He was big on that kind of thing. But he would not speculate prophetically, but his notebooks, he loved to speculate in his notebooks. He also had an expanded sense of typology and believed that the fallen world was full of types that pointed to Christ. Now, the most strange thing, my friend Jerry has written a whole book about this. He speculated in his private notebooks, hundreds of pages, according to my friend Jerry, a great deal about the possibility of those who had never heard of Christ being saved because they had received grace and enough revelation that had trickled down to them from various sources, even though they'd never heard a word about Christ. He was very much entranced with this idea, and he said it would be enough for them to understand they were in a sinful state and in a need for grace and mercy. God had given them, this is this key term, godly dispositions through grace. And if they had heard the gospel, their godly dispositions would have responded, and he opened up the possibility of them being saved. He didn't know how many, but he really, apparently hundreds of pages, Jerry says, he speculated on this. And he kept notebooks where he kept talking about all of the places in heathen religions. He was interested in world religions. He read widely in it and kept notebooks on it of things that he had heard. For example, he had heard that some ancient Greek talked about the Spirit of God moving on the waters, and some other people had talked about adultery of the heart. And he said, see, God had revealed, this had trickled down to them. Biblical truth had trickled down to them, even though they'd never seen the Bible. His notebooks were full of that. So he had a very different perspective than most evangelicals and classic Reformed theology did on the fate of the heathen. Again, this is the speculative side of Edwards. Well, let's look at his most important contribution. J.I. Packer says it's his theology of revival. My friend Jerry McDermott says it's this notion of religious affections, but these two are so closely intertwined that we're going to deal with them together. And hopefully you'll see how they're closely intertwined. By the way, Edwards pointed to Cornelius in the book of Acts as the example of someone who had a godly disposition, even before he had heard of Christ. Now, what Jonathan Edwards did was write in a context of revivals. And here's how the revival context plays a crucial role in this area, his primary contribution. Because some of the really staid ministers around Boston were looking at the revivals that were happening, and they were saying, these people are getting nuts. This is getting crazy. Especially in light of the excesses of a few. James Davenport came to New Haven, and he stripped down to his underwear while in a frenzy while preaching. He did. He stripped down to his underwear while he was preaching, and they said, this is nuts. If James Davenport down in New Haven is stripping to his underwear, these revivals must be enthusiasm. Enthusiasm was a word that meant crazy. If you were an enthusiast, you were crazy. We use the word differently, but an enthusiast was someone who was hyper and crazy. And they said that the revivals were enthusiasm. Well, Edwards defended the revivals as true works of God and his distinguishing mark of a work of the Spirit of God and his some thoughts concerning the present revival of religion. But he fleshed out the theology that underlied this, and what many have said is his greatest work on religious affections. He placed revivals at the center of God's redemptive plan for the ages, and in his postmillennial speculations, led him to believe that the revivals of his time were, as I said, precursors of the millennial age which was about to dawn. This was all, why this is called postmillennial, because Christ doesn't return till after most of the world is converted, he believed. And he was involved in an international prayer movement that was headquartered in Scotland to pray for revival. Because remember, in England and Scotland, Whitfield and Wesley and the Campbellsaying revival and others were going on at the same time. And he was in constant correspondence with these people. And he really believed God was doing a mighty work. And he was there to defend it and give the theology that underlied it. Now, what he meant by affections was not emotions nor passions, but deep-seated dispositions of the soul. That's what my friend Jerry calls them. Right? It's a good term. Now, he also said Satan loved to delude us with false religious affections. He said Satan was trained in the best divinity school of the universe, and he knew how to counterfeit religious affections. Thus, he said, even all genuine religious awakenings will have stumbling blocks, false conversions, and oppositions in addition to genuine fruit. And he experienced some of that in the church. He, by the way, eventually came to the conclusion that most of his church was unregenerate. He did. He came to the conclusion most of his church that he had pastored for all those years, and his grandfather had pastored for over 60 years, was full of unregenerates. He said, even those who are truly awakened, truly regenerate, may succumb to spiritual pride at having been awakened. In other words, I've been awakened and you haven't, so I'm proud of that. And he said, fall to temptation to look for immediate works of God without the normal means of preaching and prayer. Edwards was a beaver for the normal means of preaching and prayer that God would use. God wasn't going to use extraordinary revelations. He was going to use preaching and prayer, the normal means of grace. Yet he said revivals were immediate and genuine works of God. We can pray and preach, but only God can give genuine revival. For example, in the rural South, there's an old tradition where every year some church, usually it's the Baptist and Pentecostal churches, do revival next week. And Edwards would have said, basically, ridiculous. Why? You can't plan a revival. God gives a revival. You can't say revival meeting next week. You can say evangelistic meeting, church meeting, but you cannot call it revival because God gives revival. You don't plan on revival. He was a stickler on that point. Revivals were extraordinary works of God in which the unconverted or dull Christians were revived to have a new sense of God. It was not primarily a restoration of orthodoxy, but that could include that, but it was primarily a deepening of experiential piety, of a sense, this sense he had of the presence of God. And they were corporate affairs primarily, not individual affairs. Now, here's where he gets into his specific language. He used the language of, these are words he used, a taste or a relish of the divine sweetness. He loved taste language. He said, just like you try to describe what honey tastes like to somebody. He says, you can use words, but until they've tasted the sweetness of honey, all your words won't mean anything. But when they've tasted the sweetness of honey, they will know it. He said that's what it is with religious affections. It's a taste of the sweetness of the presence of God. In his own personal narrative, he used the term inner sweetness 55 times in 10 pages. I think he liked the term. 55 times in 10 pages, the inner sweetness of Christ, the inner sweetness of the presence of God. And some have likened it to being overwhelmed by the beauty of a piece of music or the beauty of a piece of art. I'm not an artist. And I can look sometimes at pieces of art, and generally I can say, nice piece of art, but they don't overwhelm me. I am a musician, though. And there have been times, if you're a musician, you know you're listening to a piece of music, and you can become sort of overwhelmed by it. You know, we have some musicians out there. Think about that. That's what Edwards meant by being, having this sense or this taste of God. He said that faith and love flowed from these religious affections, and they were the source of genuine godly spirituality. He said conversion was a transformation from self-love to love of divine excellency. Now, you probably have never, ever heard of conversion used in that term. From self-love to love of divine excellency. Think about his own conversion. It was meditating on the verse, not a God, immortal, invisible, God only wise. That passage was his own conversion. So this was programmatic for him, that it was this sense of the majesty and the sweetness of the beauty of holiness. All of this very taste-centered language that he used. He said this, the regenerate saw the beauty of holiness, but the unregenerate only saw holiness. See the difference? The regenerate saw the beauty of God's holiness, the symmetry, the gloriousness of God's holiness. The unregenerate just saw the holiness. It's fearful. You respond, he says, like Isaiah, woe is me, for I am undone, when you see the holiness of God. But when you see the beauty of God's holiness, that's the true spiritual sense of God. And he went through in religious affections 12 genuine and 12 non-genuine signs of true religious affection. These are his actual words here. I thought you would want to see. I just copied and pasted them in here so you could really see, including his interesting contractions, because he likes contractions, and you'll see some of them. First, religious affections are, these are the non-genuine. Can't trust these. That the affections are great or raised very high. In other words, you're excited. Not necessarily true. Affection. That they have great effects on the body. Not true. That they cause them to have them to be fluent, fervent, and abundant in talking of the things of God, things of religion. You talk a lot about your faith. Not a true sign of genuine conversion. I love this. Persons make them. That's actually what he said. He used the contraction there. Make them themselves or excite them of their own contrivance or by their own strength. In other words, you worked it up. You went to a meeting and thought, I was supposed to get excited about God, so you worked it up. False. Not a good one. They come with texts of Scripture remarkably brought to mind. Just because you can quote a lot of Scripture doesn't mean you've had true religious affections. There's an appearance of love in them. People say, oh my, he's a loving person. Not necessarily a true religious affection. Persons having religious affection of many kinds accompanying one another is not sufficient to determine whether they have gracious affections or no. In other words, you have a lot of them. That's not a truth. That's not a sign. Comforts and joys seem to follow awakenings and convictions of assurance in a certain order. In other words, I've had these certain things in a certain order. Not a true sign. They dispose persons to spend much time in religion and be engaged in the external duties of worship. You go to church a lot. You go to Bible studies a lot. You go to classes like this a lot. Not a true sign. They much dispose persons with their mouths to praise and glorify God. You can sing a lot, you can praise, you can give lots of testimonies. Not a sign of true religion. Pretty much, I'm sure you're beginning to say, ooh, what in the world is? We're not done with the false ones yet. We've got two more. He says they make persons that have them exceedingly confident that their experience is divine. In other words, you have a high level of assurance. Not necessarily true. He says Satan can counterfeit that. Number two, our last one, outward manifestations them and the relations persons give to them are very affecting and pleasing to the truly godly, and such as greatly gain their charity and win their hearts. In other words, he's saying, all your friends, Christian friends, say, oh, he's truly a godly man or woman. Don't count on that one either, he said. So, this is a pretty strong list of what are not genuine religious affections. Well, what are the genuine ones then? They arise from those influence and operations of the heart which are spiritual, supernatural, and divine. You might say, okay, but how do I know that? He's going to give you some more reasons. They are objectively grounded in the transcendently excellent and amiable nature of divine things, as they are in themselves, and not in any conceived relation they bear to self or self-interest. Ooh, this gets to be a strong one. I'm not doing this for self-interest, namely that I want to get out of hell even. He said that is just because you want to get out of hell is no reason at all to say that you've had a genuine sense of a genuine religious affection. They are primarily founded on the loveliness of the moral excellence of divine things. A love to divine things for the beauty and sweetness of their moral excellence is the first beginning and spring of all holy affection. That's what he was saying earlier. I said he was saying earlier. This sweetness, this sense, this is one of the key signs of a true affection. They arise from a mind's being enlightened rightly and spiritually to understand and apprehend divine things. They're attended with a reasonable and spiritual conviction of the judgment of the reality and certainty of divine things. I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly here. And they're attended with evangelical humility, a sense that a Christian has his or her own sense utter insufficiency, despicableness, and odiousness, with an answerable frame of heart. No. In other words, you don't think too much of yourself. They're attended with a change of nature. This is where his whole idea that conversion is something you clearly understand as your nature has changed. They tend to and are attended with the lamb-like, the dove-like spirit and temper of Christ. They naturally beget and promote such a spirit of love, meekness, quietness, forgiveness, and mercy as appeared in Christ. In other words, you're going to be Christ-like. They're going to soften your heart and are attended to and followed with a Christian tenderness of spirit. They have beautiful symmetry and proportion. In other words, you're not going to be all one thing and all not anything else. And the higher the gracious affections are raised, the more is a spiritual appetite and longing of soul after spiritual attainments increased. And the last one have their exercise and fruit in Christian practice. Now, by the way, he elaborates on the ninth sign, above all, fear of God, which is number I above. Now, here's what my friend Jerry McDermott said about these. He said when he first read these many years ago, he said it was like spiritual heart surgery and some of the anesthesia had worn off. And if any of you have ever heard John Gerstner preach his famous Wise and Foolish Virgins sermon, that is classic Edwardian spiritual counsel. In that sermon, he's preached it numerous times, in which he will preach on the wise and the foolish virgins. And you have to understand, I can hear Dr. Gerstner saying, "Oh, foolish virgins!" And he will get really intense, and he will talk about how we may be all foolish virgins who are self-deluded to think that we're genuinely converted. And R.C. Sproul says that every time Dr. Gerstner would preach that, he would have to come up afterwards and say, "Now, I know 90% of you are now convinced you're not converted." Because it is like spiritual heart surgery. If you read this list and you find yourself saying, like Jerry said, "Oh, man, how could I possibly know that I'm genuinely converted after that list?" It's designed to do that. And my friend Jerry always warns readers of Jonathan Edwards on religious affections of perfectionism. That Edwards is saying you have to perfectly have all of these, and he said Edwards didn't expect that, but he said these were the true and the false signs. And Edwards was addressing an expression of cheap grace and antinomianism. What is cheap grace? Cheap grace is simply said, I made a profession of faith, so now count me in. I'm clearly in. He had come to the conclusion, as I said, that most of his congregation were not really regenerate. They were hypocrites. You know, if I was a pastor and had to deal with the congregation he did, maybe I would have come to the same conclusion. But I convinced that there probably were just some simultaneously sinners and saints, as Luther talked about, like any congregation. But he was somebody who was going to push the signs of true conversion to the ultimate limit. Historian Harry Stout, as I said, who's the Yale University professor, head of the Jonathan Edwards Center, and general editor of the collected works of Jonathan Edwards, says this: he brought people to the experiential edge without plunging them into enthusiasm. In other words, Edwards' goal is to bring you to the very edge of doubting your salvation so that you look honestly and say, is my conversion genuine? That's why I said his is this experiential kind of revivalistic Reformed theology. Very different than what Luther and Calvin and most of the early Reformers. They understood that there were false conversions, false professions. But Edwards is going to push you to the very edge. So, what can we learn from Edwards? First of all, not a head-heart distinction. Edwards would have had none of that. For him, he held both together. Edwards was a theologian of the heart. There's actually a book, a guy named Harold Simonson wrote a book, Jonathan Edwards, Theologian of the Heart. Other people said, yeah, that's half true. He was also a theologian of the head, because he wrote heady, speculative times doctrines. But no head-heart distinction, but both and. However, in spite of some awkwardness, I think, in his treatise on the freedom of the will, I find some aspects of it awkward, but I think he's onto a very valid point. I don't believe that there's a faculty called will that we have, which is disconnected from who we are as people. And that's why I think the classic Reformation understanding is valid. that we need a change of who we are by grace in order to freely exercise our wills toward good. Because there isn't a faculty called will that's hanging out there just willy-nilly, not choosing one thing or the other, but it's choosing according to who we are. In other words, Edwards points us to the biblical stress that regeneration precedes faith. We don't believe to become regenerate. God regenerates us and then we believe. Without the new birth, Jesus says we can't see the kingdom of God. John says we are born not of human will, but of God in John 1:12. Edwards has a particular, I think at times slightly unorthodox from the classic Reformed tradition understanding of that, but his bottom line is still very valid, that the rationalistic Arminian teaching that he was against was simply dead wrong, that people could just buck it up and do what's right and trust in Christ without divine grace. And Edwards was strongly emphasizing we need divine grace. He is a reminder that genuine revival is clearly a divine gift, not something you can plan for, although we can long for it and pray for it. But he's also important for us because he will remind us that with genuine revival comes strife, contentions, false conversions, because Satan is at work as well. Have there been genuine revivals in our times? I think there have been. Some of you have been influenced by the Jesus movement. I know my wife, your wife was, in Wichita, Kansas. But strife and struggles and problems also came. But there's never been a single revival that hasn't had strife and difficulties. It has split churches. In New England, churches were splitting right and left over the revival because some people thought it was crazy and other people thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, spiritually. And it caused contention. Edwards is a reminder of that, and he helps us distinguish between what is true and what is false revival. And he reminds us that we need to be very discerning about what is genuine spirituality and what is not. He reminds us that much of what we often take as true conversion can clearly be counterfeited by Satan. I can tell you that Jonathon Edwards would have come to the average evangelical approach to conversion and would say this is all mostly a phony approach to conversion. Walking on an aisle in a revival meeting, praying a prayer, inviting Jesus into my heart. He would have said, it has nothing to do with genuine conversion. Where's the sense of the true sense of God? And he said, he would have said it's possible somebody could be converted through that. But he would have said, most of you people are saying, if I do these things, stamp, convert, genuine convert. And he would have said, by no means. He said, classic way for people to be self-deluded. I said a prayer, I invite Jesus into my life, stamped convert. He would have said, hold on there, highly likely not a convert. Until you can sense, do they have the genuine spiritual sense, the genuine sense of the beauty of holiness? He said, that is when you can tell you have a genuine convert. Not that they said said some prayer with you, I invite Jesus into my heart, or something like that. He would have said absolutely the wrong way to go. And yet that's garden variety, what so many evangelicals have based everything on. So he would have been very, very, very hard, shall we say, on that approach. Now, even if he sometimes, the last point, even if he sometimes goes overboard, I think he does, on self-examination, 2 Corinthians 13:5 says, examine yourself to see whether you are of the faith, is biblical. And claims to be converted without biblical fruit are false claims. And Edwards is absolutely right. If there's no fruit, those are false claims. Now, if you're like my friend Jerry, or like the people who listen to John Gerstner's Wise and Foolish Virgin sermon, and you feel like you've had surgery with the anesthetic was wearing off sometimes after reading this, that's what can happen. And I do think Edwards personally pushes this, and he loses some of the Reformation sense of assurance of salvation at times. But he's right to say that self-examination is something we need to take more seriously, because it has not been taken seriously by a lot of churches. Full of people that they have stamped convert on them that are not likely to be converts at all. And he would have argued that most churches have far more false converts than we oftentimes recognize. Well, that's Jonathan Edwards, like I said, a great theologian. I have great respect for him, but again, I have my quibbles at points that some of my friends who are, my friend Jerry, who just loves Jonathan Edwards and about everything about Jonathan Edwards, would have. The next time we meet, we're going to talk about Schleiermacher. He goes to the opposite end. He's one, I'll tell you, he's a theologian I don't like at all, but he's in everybody's list of influential theologians, so that's why we're going to talk about it. But any questions that anybody has? Yeah.
It almost seems like he elevates himself as the judge.
Not really. He doesn't mean to do that.
But he comes across that way.
He could, but he's...
Okay.
Yeah, what he's saying is that there needs to be real, genuine evidence. And he's saying that, because he argues that it's extremely easy to be self-deluded. And that's the point that he's trying to make. Yeah.
I mean, as far as the genuine evidence that you said, only if he believes that it's genuine. Doesn't matter what everybody else. I mean, I understand like that his position and all that. He can do that. But my question is more so where it says, I know he didn't write it, but where it says, claims to be converted without biblical fruit as false claims. So are you saying like he was not preaching that, but he was...
Well, he would preach that.
So
he would have said that
what would be the difference between like the millennial that you were mentioning earlier, where everybody, it'll be trickle down, like maybe not have the biblical word, but through...
Well, he would have argued that God had worked a great work of grace in their lives, given them the godly disposition, and they would have picked up snippets of biblical truth, like that God, he was extremely optimistic anytime he saw something that in pagan writings that resembled Scripture, that had come from Scripture, and it trickled down to them from a scriptural source, maybe 5 steps removed. But he always was getting, this was something, my friend Jerry has studied all this. He said he had notebooks after notebooks about examples of biblical phrases that would show up in pagans miles away from Palestine, for example, in pre-Christian days, ancient Greeks and others.
So in those other forms of religion that are kind of having those biblical texts or phrases, they don't have, my understanding is they didn't come from the Bible necessarily.
Well, he would argue that they came 3rd and 4th or 5th hand from the Bible. That's kind of what he's saying. It's all speculation. He never preached any of this, but they were in his notebooks. It's clearly something that he thought about a lot.
And further to that, I guess I was just thinking when he said God has given them godly dispositions through grace. So is that what we would think of as general revelation?
No, he didn't say it was general revelation. He said they did have some general revelation, but that the godly dispositions are given by grace apart from the revelation, but that they would then be positively disposed into the general revelation when they saw it. Does that clarify for you?
Because they had the disposition.
Yeah, because they had the godly disposition. It's a very interesting thing, and like I said, my friend Jerry has written a whole book on this, Jonathan Edwards' attitude toward world religions, and he's very positive about the possibility of grace outside of verbal proclamations of the gospel, which is very different than classic evangelical and reformed tradition.
Not gonna lie, the 12 signs of the nons, I was like, that seems like a good person. I mean, okay.
Yeah.
At least, not all of them, but...
Well, his point is that we get fooled sometimes into thinking people are genuine Christians, and he said these signs are not necessarily the genuine signs. Kendrick.
Did this come, these 12 signs, positive and negative, did they come after his pastoral ministry? So that he was reflecting back on those people?
No, it was in the midst of the pastoral ministry at Northampton Church. I can't remember the exact date. I'd have to look and see. Maybe I can get the date, because he left in 1749 from the church. Let me see if I can get the date at which.
Oh, it's okay. I just...
Yeah.
Does he have a scriptural basis for each one of these things? Or?
Yeah, he did. He did try to give scriptural basis, but mostly it was he would hear these reports, and he would be interested in them. And they excited him that this was a possibility. Yeah.
I think what Alan was asking was for these 12.
Oh, yeah, he has scripture for all of those points.
Oh, okay.
The 12 positive, yeah, he has scripture. Long expositions of scripture behind all of these. I'm just giving you the points.
For all 24?
Yeah. And you can get for $10, you can buy, it's 380 some pages or something like that, so it's massive. But you can buy it for $10 if you want to read it, and you can read the whole thing. It's like, you know, my friend Jerry warned me, it'd be like heart surgery, because that's what it's like. But it's a classic text.
I
Yeah.
was gonna say, these first, the non-genuine, they all seem to be really public, whereas,
The other ones are interior.
yeah, our interior, so, and I think with our sin nature, as soon as we become public, then we're right away tempted to be concerned for what other people think of us.
Mhm.
And so that's why they would be
Yeah, and he said the problem with that comes is that we can only look at of course, the external. And he says, therefore, we have a tendency to stamp convert on all kinds of people. And then we are shocked when we find out later that they turned out to be rotten wretches and do things like kick you out of your church and gouge people with high prices and do all this other stuff. And which is why he came to the conclusion that a big percentage of his church were non-regenerate, because he said they did stuff like that.
And so the way I take the 24 is the non was, like she said, public. What does everybody else think of you? Are you a good person? Are you shouting? Are you whatever? And then the other 12
You go to church a lot, yeah.
have you found it in yourself? Not necessarily so I can promote it and advertise it, but do I believe that this is who I am? Type.
The biggest critique, I can tell you, for example, what a classic Lutheran, how they would respond to Jonathan Edwards, and they would scream bloody murder. And they would say, Jonathan Edwards turns you inward to look for the godly dispositions, whereas Luther and Calvin said, turns you outward, look to Christ, knowing that when we look inward, we will always be tempted to see the false things, and then get in turmoil whether we see the true ones. Now, Edwards has got a valid point that Scripture does tell us sometimes to examine ourselves, again from 2 Corinthians 13:8. But I think it's a balance between the two, because in that sense, as I said, Edwards takes this turn. Now, I find it interesting, too, that while there were Congregationalists who followed him, most of the Presbyterian theologians were always uneasy with Edwards, because they said it was too much conversionism, too much emphasis on this heartfelt internal looking. But a lot of Southern Baptists in the colonial days picked up on it. And much of the early revivalism in the South were Baptist Edwardsians, shall we say, who had a strong emphasis on the big wham-bam conversion. Because the wham-bam conversion fits with this idea of the internal.
And they work together, both the internal and the external. You have to accept Christ into your heart. That's both internal and external, so to speak. I mean, you could look at it as just being internal, but I kind of see them kind of both going hand in hand.
Yeah, John.
I understand Gerstner's Foolish Virgin's sermon more, which drove me to despair when you and I listened to that. But I just don't know how you can judge yourself to be sufficiently strong.
That's
in
the
these
problem.
12.
How sufficiently unself-interested am I? How sufficiently is my relish of the divine things? It becomes tricky.
But
Yeah.
you have to think about yourself all the time,
Yes.
and what your heart is doing. And I mean, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked.
Exactly. And that's why, as I said, the Princetonians were always uneasy with aspects of Edwards's and the New Divinity people who followed him, because some of the New Divinity people even hyped it up even more.
If you think about it, though, none of us are perfect, and we always have something that there's always something that can be improved that you can work on.
Yeah. Well, that's why my friend Jerry says don't fall into perfectionism when you start reading it. Yeah. Al.
Well, that's kind of along the lines of what I was thinking. I was wondering, did he see, like we often refer to people as being baby Christians, and more mature Christians, did he?
Yeah, I think he would have clearly agreed that there was that, and that the
Oh, okay.
more you mature, the more your sense of the divine things will grow. I think he would have said that.
Okay.
With age comes wisdom.
Yeah.
The internal, once you have the internal, then that produces the external.
That's exactly, that's his key point.
Yeah.
The internal sense of the divine things are what produces the external.
Not just the external. I mean, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees, you know, you whitewash tombs.
Exactly.
Because you're doing everything right on the outside, and that was, makes me think of that.
Right.
Looking from the outside, it could be that you're doing all the right things, but that doesn't mean necessarily that the inside is correct, in line with Christ. Yeah.
I see some folks are leaving, but if a couple of you want to still stand there and talk about this, I'd be happy to, because it's or we can conclude it here. But yeah, it's a very, he's a brilliant thinker, and his religious affections and his revival writings are generally conceived to be the best things that he did. Even though the professional philosophers love dabbling in his philosophical stuff, freedom of the will, original sin, all that other stuff. But this is the one where the rubber meets the road for Christians, and he's challenging. He is the theologian that more than anyone else who's wrestled through those questions. Well, as I said, the next time we meet, whether it's next week or the following week, we'll talk about a very different kind of theologian. So we'll talk about it then.